post here on Twitter real quickly now that we're live. Okay, we are going live and we're getting a little bit of a late start, but it's going to be all the better for that. Let me I guess we'll just pin that there and that'll be enough. Okay, we'll ignore that. Now we've downloaded the video so that hopefully there's not streaming issues, although I've seen it buffer in downloaded versions. So YouTube is really testing my patience. Oh, you downloaded, but it's not on your computer. You have to be through their website. I don't know. But whatever, we're going to see how well that works. And today we're going to rapidly finish up the very last bit of what he's going to talk about. And then I have made unbelievably extensive notes because in our after conversations, we've had lots of really good questions trying to target what it is that Peterson's perspective of the Bible is, what his approach is, whether or not he thinks it's the only approach, the correct approach. There's different components to it and how they relate to each other. So we are going to actually have a really good conversation with that, and I've got the slides made up. So before we do that, though, let us jump in.
Of ideas that's associated with the notion of divinity, okay? And then we'll turn back to the first lines when we start the next lecture. I have no idea how far I'm going to get through the biblical stories, by the way, because I'm trying to figure this out as I go along. Okay, so, you know, there's an idea in Christianity that the image of God is a trinity, right? There's the Father, there's the element of the Father, there's the element of the Son, and there's the element of the Holy Spirit. And it's something like tradition, the spirit of tradition. It's something like the human being as the newest incarnation of that tradition, like the living incarnation of that tradition. And then it's something like the spirit in people that makes relationship with this and this possible, the spirit in individuals. And so I'm going to bounce my way quickly through some of the classical metaphorical attributes of God so that we kind of have a cloud of notions about what we're talking about when we return to Genesis 1 and talk about the God who spoke chaos into being. So there's a fatherly aspect. So here's what God as a father is like. You can enter into a covenant with it. So you can make a bargain with it. Now you think about that. Money is like that. Because money is a bargain you make with the future. Right? And so we've structured our world so that you can negotiate with the future. And I don't think that we would have got to the point where we could do that without having this idea to begin with. You can act as if the future is a reality. There's a spirit of tradition that enables you to act as if the future is something that can be bargained with. That's why you make sacrifices, right? And the sacrifices were acted out for a very long period of time, and now they're psychological. We know that you can sacrifice something valuable in the present and expect that you're negotiating with something that represents the transcendent future. And that's amazing human discovery. Like no other creature can do that, to act as if the future is real. To note that you can bargain with reality itself and that you can do it successfully. It's unbelievable. It responds to sacrifice. It answers prayers. I'm not saying that any of this is true, by the way. I'm just saying what the cloud of ideas represents. It punishes and rewards. It judges and forgives. It's not nature. You see, one of the things that's weird about the Judeo-Christian tradition is that God and nature are not the same thing at all. Whatever God is, partially manifest in this logos, is something that stands outside of nature. And I think that's something like consciousness as abstracted from the natural world. So it built Eden for mankind and then banished us for disobedience. It's too powerful to be touched.
So one of the things we're going to talk about to answer those other questions later today, pay attention to the qualifiers that he's using. It's something like this. It means something like that. It means at least this much. He's going to use those phrases continually throughout, and it's going to be a key to understanding his approach to all this.
Granted free will. Distance from it is hell. Distance from it is death. It reveals itself in dogma and in mystical experience, and it's the law. So that's sort of like the fatherly aspect. And then the son-like aspect, it speaks chaos into order. It slays dragons and feeds people with the remains. It finds gold. It rescues virgins. It's the body and blood of Christ. It's a tragic victim and scapegoat and eternally triumphant redeemer simultaneously. It cares for the outcast. It dies and is reborn. It's the King of kings and hero of heroes. It's not the state, is both the fulfillment and critic of the state. It dwells in the perfect house. It is aiming at paradise or heaven. It can rescue from hell. It cares for the outcast. It's the foundation stone and the cornerstone that was rejected. And it's the spirit of the law. And then it's spirit-like. It's akin to the human soul. It's the prophetic voice.
All right, we're going to break down everything we got from this first video, but we're also going to break down all of the hints about his approach and the way he thinks about things. One of the things to remember for when we get to that at the end of this class here, when we'll talk about it, is that there's a triunity at the base of being. In Peterson's conception of the cosmos, what emerges is something like order, chaos, and the line between them. Okay, there's a trinity in all of this, and we'll talk about it in depth.
It's the still small voice of conscience. It's the spoken truth. It's called forth by music. It is the enemy of deceit, arrogance, and resentment. It's the water of life. It burns without consuming, and it's a blinding light. Okay, so that's a very well-developed poetic set of poetic metaphors, essentially, right? So these are all, what would you say, glimpses of the transcendent ideal. That's the right way of thinking about it. They're glimpses of the transcendent ideal. And all of them have a specific meaning. And, well, in part, what we're going to do is go over that meaning as we continue with this series. And so what we've got now is a brief description, at least, of what this is. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We know it's associated with the logos in this sequence of stories. We know it's associated with the word and with consciousness. And we know that it's associated with whatever God is. And then I laid out the metaphoric landscape that at least in part describes God. And so now we have some sense of the being that does this, creates the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. That's that chaotic state of intermingled confusion. And darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And so we'll stop with that, because now we're ready to take a tentative step into the very first part of this book. And it's important to have your conceptual framework properly organized so that you can appreciate where it's going and what it might possibly mean. And so, well, I've done what I can today to, what would you say, elaborate on this single word, I suppose. And but it's a big word, you know, so it's not so unreasonable that it takes a long time to get to the point where you have any sense of what it means at all. All right. That is nowhere near, that is not, I thought I would get a lot farther than that. All right. So thank you very much. So we do have time for some questions. We have to be out of here at 10:30. It's 9:30, so maybe we'll have questions.
Okay. In class 7, we've made it through his first video. What a lot of fun. Few things to talk about. We're going to go over all of this. It's going to be really fun. I want to remind us that the context of this year 3 class is in the backbone course is Decoding Zarathustra, which we did in an unrecorded version on Twitter Spaces last year. We're going to be doing it again recorded at some point. But accompanying that are the children or twins of Nietzsche. So we've got the good twin or the evil twin, however you want to think about it, of Nietzsche's existentialism. We're going to be looking and doing a deep dive into Kierkegaard, Jung, and Jordan Peterson as the best students of Nietzsche, or the children of Nietzsche, or thinkers that perhaps Nietzsche paved the way for and made possible. So that's one of the contexts of our course and our focus. It's not going to be the main thing we're talking about, because what we're doing is a deep dive. We want to understand Peterson. We want to understand how he thinks, and but we're going to do it in that context. So let's go through what we've gotten from this first video so far. Long verily should we have to wait until someone reawoke thy God for thee, says Zarathustra. There's a context here. Okay, in these slides, we're going to have Nietzsche's, or I'm sorry, the notes on Peterson's lecture are going to be white with that green bar in the bottom, where discussions of his views are going to be color coded. We will subdivide his lectures into sections. They'll look like this slide here. And then we will do questions and answers from the video as well, with his audience question to the left and answers to the right. We're going to be focusing on understanding what he's teaching. We're going to be focusing as well to try to extract the methods by which he's using, like the things he's justifying as a ways of approaching things, and justifying that there's a source of meaning and truth, sorry, within these things. We're going to try to extract, I mean, this course is amazing. His course, I mean, the psychological significance of the biblical series. It's like he's got incredible psychology he talks about. He's we're going to be able to extract the Jungian keys for understanding myth. It's all just in there as he goes through the process of saying, look, this is one way that you could be reading the Bible. Okay, so video 1. He Now, one of the ways of thinking about what he did in the beginning of this video is justifying what we're going to be doing in the course. In other words, he's showing up on stage. He said he made this joke once. He said, "Okay, imagine you went to a bunch of financiers and you said, here's what I want to do. Give me some money. What I'm going to do is rent out a stage. I'm going to pack it every week to read the Bible to people." There's a good business plan. But it happened and it worked, and it's kind of, it's something to take notice. It's miraculous. It's impressive. But in order to do that, the first thing we wanna know is, all right, how is Peterson approaching the Bible in this course? Is that the only way he thinks it's appropriate to approach the Bible? And can we get hints of whether or not he thinks that? Hold on a moment. We're always working with technology. Okay. So but also he's in the context of the post-Cartesian scientism age, the place where we've not only, the place that Nietzsche described, where we've elevated scientific objective truth to the highest value, and then that itself has killed our ability to understand mythopoetry, has killed our ability to believe in God, has killed God for us. That science was invented by Christianity also because um this perspective of being outside the universe, like it's sitting there on a carpenter's bench, we'll say carpenter's bench, and you've got tape measures and you can see the clockwork functioning of it, and imagine that perspective is something that was invented by Christianity with this ex nihilo in the post-Cartesian understanding of God and creation. And that what that did is it allowed us to have this other way of thinking about things that makes it seem like everything else is worthless. But then Peterson's going to come in and say, okay, well, Nietzsche made fun of the scientismists. He smashed them with his hammer. He made fun of the new atheists. He absolutely, we can look at those passages. He absolutely bashed them to bits in Nietzschean fashion. And, in our course on Zarathustra, we'll get to read those passages. Um, and he talked about, he he suggested to this world that was drunk on an idea that was going to kill it, that perhaps we don't know how to think and approach these things at all. And Peterson, and through Jung, is going to um, give us a new way of approaching the Bible, which is actually an old way of approaching the Bible, right? So somebody asked the question in the after conversation: is Peterson the first person to come up with this idea of approaching the Bible? Well, certainly he's got his psychology interest, and so a lot of what he's trying to get out of the mythopoetry is through the lens of, is this saying something that's true in the science that I know, and things like that. But rather, another way of understanding it would be to say, well, who the hell ever read Shakespeare, sat it down and said, I'm a historian and I think objectively and factually King Lear never said these things, right? Like, nobody was reading it in that way and judging it or defending it in that way, right? So you've got the fundamentalists and the Dawkinites. We're not going to pick on Richard Dawkins, but a lot of his followers, who are going to say, look, I've judged the Bible according to the scales of, is it objectively true? And the Petersonian approach is to respond to that with, you both missed the point of the story. So the background and then the other attack is, of course, the postmodernist attack. So what he's going to do to start out is he has to say, look, okay, I'm going to start talking here, but it's not in the way that you're used to hearing people talk. I'm going to defend it, and I'm going to start defending it with these Jungian and Nietzschean and Dostoevskian ideas. So that's what he does first in this. What we'll be doing in the course, the argument for why we need to do what we'll be doing in this course. The Bible is a book cobbled together from contradictory sources. All right, so we don't have to read all of the notes, but these were all things that he said. He's talking about Nietzsche. Science couldn't have gotten off the ground. It's, you could even think of it as a sub denomination of Christianity in a sense. So Nietzsche's criticism of the new atheists is that they were far too monotheistic for him. And we'll get to read those passages. But uh, then he brings up a psychological idea about the development of actualizing or becoming an adult. So he's talking about childhood development, adult. I don't know if he talked about it in this one. I think he's going to talk about it in a future one. But the process of learning that there's a game with rules, learning what the rules are, learning that you can be a part of adjusting the rules or something like that. Um, and so one of the things, just from the psychological perspective, that Peterson again, he just said it now, and he said it means at least this much, or it's a glimpse of that, or it's a partial glimpse of the transcendent. Right? We'll look at those qualifiers and what that means for his evaluation of the depth and the meaning of books like these. But was to say, well, God is like the light of consciousness. Well, okay, is he being reductivist? Is he saying the story breaks down into a code where every time you see God, you say, oh, that means light of consciousness? He's absolutely not doing that, and we'll look at that at the end of these slides. We've got a section on understanding the difference between symbolism and signs and things like that. And another thing to remember is that he thinks these things are so profoundly deep because they come from the Jungian dream world. We can skip through this because we did talk about a lot of these notes before. But the Jungian dream world is so deeply profound that it's kind of like you can't pry up anything beneath it. So he talks about Nietzsche, he talks about Jung. We'll skip through all of this. He gives an example from Moses about his notion of revelation. So his idea of revelation goes something like this: people were living for hundreds of thousands of years. They were behaving, and behavior comes prior to knowing that you're behaving according to principles. And then they were observing each other. And the genius artists, the best dreamers in this Jungian sense, are paying careful attention to that, but they're not describing it in propositional form. What it's more like something subconscious, and their connection to the dream archetypal realm is figuring out the patterns of being and then depicting it for us in artistic sculpture, painting, and narrative and story. And so in that way, we're shown a mirror of ourselves. And that's the way to understand the meaning that can be gotten from art. He gives examples of Marduk. Okay, so then he talks about his approaches, and he identifies rational but not overly reductionistic, phenomenological. We've paid careful attention and talked a lot about this as in 6 videos where we've watched little bits of this first 2 hours of his series. Um, but we can just highlight a few before we get into our notes talking about all this. The Bible is a hypertext book, a hyperlinked book. Okay, so his answer to the postmodernists is a pragmatist answer. It's really interesting. Again, he has to justify this, right? Because if you just said, hey, I'm going to read the Bible to you, there's a bunch of scientismists and there's a bunch of postmodernists who are going to say, we already know why that's not worthwhile. And so he's answering those questions in this whole first video to say, look, here's the space and here's what makes it appropriate to do this. And here's how I'm going to go about doing it. So his answer to the postmodernists is a pragmatic answer. And that doesn't mean saying, well, this will work and that's fine. I don't care about truth anymore. As Savad is well aware, the pragmatists had a definition of truth, which was something like the idea that you're operating your life according to better fucking work, or your map of reality is therefore not accurate. It's false. So truth is that which fits you in the world correctly, so that as a being looking for a truth to live by, right, these are the kinds of truths we're looking for in these stories. It's not a factual objective truth or a formulaic description of the likelihood of event A given data points A, B, and C, or B, C, D, and D, or something like that. No, what we're looking for is truths to live by, ways of conceptualizing ourselves and the reality of the world we live in And the people who were working on that, without consciously knowing it, but through revelation or through a connection with the muses or through artistic genius or however you want to conceptualize it. And he gave explanations of ways of thinking about that that didn't rely on mysticism. But he always, and we'll talk about his qualifiers, he always says it's at least that much. It means something like that. It's true in at least to that degree. And so we'll talk about that later. But so for the postmodernists, it's like, well, I can interpret this book in any way. So how can you say there's a canonical interpretation of the book, that there's a proper way of interpreting it? And the pragmatists are go, yeah, you can do that with all the facts of reality too. And so we're back in the chaos, the pre-cosmogoric, the pre-creative chaos, and everything is true and nothing is true, and things are popping in and going out of existence. We have nothing to grab onto. It's like, or we could recognize characters as fundamentally real, primordially real, that that the nature of being is own like habitable world that you could look at as a character and say it is good, is the sort of thing that is organized by creatures with an aim. Okay. So then if you believe that, or if you think in that way, then the pragmatist can say, well, do these ideas get you to your aim, or do they make you fall into a pit? Is the map you're using leading you the wrong direction or the right direction for your own self-defined aim? Right. So it's a specific type of answer to the postmodernist um challenge, and it's the one that Peterson clearly lives in. We talked about all this when we were doing the videos, so let's just keep going. We talked a lot about the phenomenological, but we could maybe, okay, so again, with the truths to live by, um, Peterson doesn't deny a materialistic world. He's not being an idealist person, philosopher. What he's saying is, you know what is also real? What makes up at least half of reality is the way that things feel and the way they seem, and the fact that they're real to us. So he's not reducing it to just that. He's not denying a material world. He's saying there's matter and there's what matters. So we've talked in depth about all this, so we don't have to go more in depth to it now. He talks about the Bible. There's a few things I've added here just because some of the members of our class who are gone today for reasons uh, that were unavoidable and necessary, we're asking questions from a more fundamentalist approach to the whole Bible thing. And we're going to answer some of those questions later. We're going to focus on them a lot. But one of them was, here's a challenge to people who believe in the Bible, if you believe in it in that post-Cartesian scientism way, like it's here to give me facts. Well, first of all, you don't read it that way. You don't read it that way most of the time when you're getting deep, profound truth out of it. And Peterson's just pointing that out, right? He's not inventing a new way of approaching it. He's justifying it, identifying it, putting it into words, and arguing that it's a correct way to approach literature and narrative and great mythopoetic texts. But also, one of the things that challenges people, especially if they're raised fundamentalist and then they go to seminary, is to learn about the history of the Bible and how it came about. So he talks about that. He talks about how there are linguists and students of the text who have identified at least four sources. So we've got a book in Genesis here. We've got a book in the Pentateuch, but the way that the language is being used here and over here is very similar, whereas the way it's being used over here is very different. And so we think we can identify different free books that existed to be turned into and compiled maybe by Moses or by somebody else before or after. All these things are argued, and there's a whole academic set of disciplines all about this topic. And he's bringing up that, okay, there's all these arguments, but one of the views is that there's the priestliest, the Yahwehist, the Elohist, and the Deuteronomist sources. Now, nobody's found these books, but they're using textual analysis, and so he talks about that. He talks about some of the characteristics of them. And then here you can look at, okay, so I've added a few things. You can look at the sources of the Pentateuch. And so there's this idea that, well, these verses over here, these sections, they seem to be in all three of these sources, that they're all three talking about this, or these three are talking about this one, but this bit only appears in one of the sources. Again, we don't have the sources, but they're saying, the language that makes it look like the blue text or the light blue text, the green text or the yellow text, they seem to have come from different written traditions or that probably came from different oral traditions. And I know we just skipped past all this, but he talks a great deal about, cultures not changing, staying the same. And if cultures are orienting themselves around the stories, then you can assume the stories weren't changing. Or when the cultures did change and the stories did change, they mirror each other and all of that. I know we skipped through it now, but those were things he talked about. So what I wanted to do is add a few other theories to this, especially since we have some fundamentalists who are interested in all of this and trying to understand, is there a value in the way Peterson is approaching the Bible? And I kind of sketched it on a spectrum and say, okay, on one side, there are people who think God wrote the Bible word for word and handed it to Moses like he did the Ten Commandments, or like the text says he did in the Ten Commandments. And on the other end, Moses made it all up or someone later did. Okay. So somewhere in between that spectrum, you know, and if you want to be a cynical postmodernist, you say somebody much later did and they made it up in order to manipulate people or whatever, right? But there's a few other sort of groups I think exist. So there are Moses compiled together the verbal traditions and codified them for the first time. That's one way of thinking about it. Then there's this other way from, again, with this scholastic evidence here, this scholarly work that, well, there were kind of maybe four written sources that were perhaps authored and compiled and edited previously, and then Moses worked from those to make the one text that we're still using today, that type of thing. And then there's a very interesting theory that doesn't come up too often, but there's a group of scholars who I've happened to do a deep dive into a long time ago. Their view is quite interesting, and I think that, Mark in particular might appreciate this. In the parts of the text of Genesis where it says, "These are the generations of Enoch. These are the generations of Japheth. These are the generations of Seth," right? "These are the generations of Adam." What they do is they interpret that as a prescript. In other words, somebody compiled all of the writings of the regal leaders of the family, of the tribe, who were scribing and writing down the things that were important in their time. So what you get are, the generations, and then you get the stories that are relevant to that person, and then you get these are the generations of so and so. And so what they see in that is actually a whole bunch of written traditions that were actually written down by the individuals at the time, that were then later compiled into maybe one of these other four. A couple interesting points about that. I'm not advocating for it. We're just talking about all these different ideas. An interesting point about that is that there is the phrase, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth." Uh, So if it is the language of a prescript saying, "Hey, these are the writings of Seth, and these are the writings of Enoch, and these are the recordings of the time that so and so was the head of the line of the family." These were people who had, massive tribes and huge flocks and many dependents in various ways upon them, and so it wouldn't be that ridiculous to think that they're making legally significant documents. We were here first. Here's our record. There's another person that's worth reading. Ayan Hirsi Ali wrote, I think, 4 books now. In one of them, I think it was The Caged Virgin. She talks about her childhood in Somalia. And one of the things she says is, when we were 3 or 4, we were taught how to repeat all of the generations of our ancestors back like 30 generations. I am the daughter of so and so, who's the son of so and so, who's the son of so and so, who's the son of so and so, who is the son of so and so. And this is like highly significant stuff to teach. And it was taught in that verbal tradition sort of way. She's out there writing right now. She's a very interesting person. Too interesting to skip, but unfortunately, it's too tangential for us to talk about right now. We'll have a chance to talk about her another time. But she's depicting what her childhood was like, and says, "Look, this is what 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds learn to do. It's like learning to count. You learn it first. Well, why? Well, because if you're in the desert and you get lost and you meet a stranger, he's liable to kill you. But if you can prove that you're cousins, even 27 times removed cousins, he now feels a duty to protect you, to have honor amongst the community of the family." These are tribal people thinking in a tribal way. So the idea that it was a prescript or a signature of the different groups, and that it would start with something like that isn't too ridiculous. Um, in any case, we don't know the answers to these things, and it's an interesting topic. And somewhere on the spectrum might be the answer. I put this in. My guess is it's somewhere around there, actually, but who knows? And what does it matter? I'm not an expert on this, so take that with a big grain of salt and go dive in. There's all sorts of resources for people who are interested in that question. And we can talk about that if anybody wants, and we can go and point in the right direction. Okay, so he gets all the way to this. Well, no, this is actually much earlier. He talks about this notion, the logos, a Christian notion. So he talks about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's a verse for you right there, by the way. It's John 1:1. And it's showing the Christian conception and the understanding of Genesis 1, and that the idea that they're well, I don't want to talk about too many theological ideas that Peterson didn't talk about, but he did talk about this verse. And the principle is that there's a triunity at the base of being, is partly what the story is saying. Now, notice I'm using qualifiers, and we'll talk about all his qualifiers later because he thinks that the language of mythopoetry is so profound that the point is that you can't reduce it to statements that are propositional like the ones we're using. So what you do is you get your best ability to try to put it into words, maintaining the humility of saying, look, I'm not saying here's a bunch of propositions. You could read this instead of reading the story. The story, every time you go back to it, you get a new layer of meaning, and it seems bottomlessly profound. So that's part of the reason for the qualifiers. But um, it seems like the artists and the inspired prophets who were coming up with these stories, and he talks about the Marduk story. There's Marduk, there's Tiamat, and there's Absu. There's this trinity of order, chaos, and the thing which can figure out how to communicate between the principles properly in order to create a world that we can live in. Right? There's the we started the Ovid's Metamorphoses a long time ago and we stopped it, but in Ovid's Metamorphoses, I mean, these are people trying to figure out what world they live in, and they're coming to very, very similar stories with similar insights. Now, Peterson's not as interested in showing that they're all the same. That could be interesting. He's not arguing, well, this one's superior to that one, and he's not arguing that they're all saying the same thing. What he's saying is if we understand what they were about and what they were trying to do, we could read it the way people used to just take for granted reading it. And we might be able to have the ears to hear and be able to get this profound tsunami of meaning. We could unlock it. So, um, so in any case, back to the Greeks, the whole story of Zeus getting along with his wife and ordering the court and the kingdom properly is a reflection of habitable order and human existence. And there's principles that come before Zeus, and there's things he's relating to and working with. And it's a quite interesting way of, well, we won't get into the tangent there, but the point that there is a trinity at the base of being seems to be a rather astonishing. You know what? Let's do this really quickly. We're trying to make sense of the world. One of the ways we try to make sense of the world is scientifically. The concepts we don't seem to be able to get away from for understanding the world conceptually in that scientific framework are space, matter, and time. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe somebody would say fields or potentialities or probabilism or something like that. But it's really hard to talk about anything that you want to observe without utilizing those concepts. Do we really want to go into this? I'll do it as briefly as I can. We've done a longer version of this before. Imagine you walk into it, imagine you're in some celestial place and you walk into the Museum of All That Is. That's the title of it, the Museum of All That Is. And you walk into the great open first hallway and you see three sort of like rectangular fish tanks on pedestals and one larger one right in the middle, and you see there's little plaques on them. So you walk up into the center of this vast room up to that exhibit, and what you see is the title, the universe of z- yeah, the universe of zeroness or nothingness, and it's just empty. There's no bit of it that is anything. It's not even got space in it, or it's just nothingness. Okay. But then you look at the in the triangularly set up, you look at the other one, it says the universe of oneness. And there's one thing there. It's like a uniform, simple, you could try to conceptualize it as maybe like a sphere that's homogeneous in its construction, that's made up of identical um, copper atoms or something. But of course, that's too pluralistic because there's more than one atom. But so think of it as just one atom, maybe just one proton or something like that. But the question is that really a universe with anything? Because the proton, we know it exists because it can make itself felt. It has nothing to pull on. So it doesn't know that anything is there. To it, there's a nothingness. And to anything else, there's nothing there because there's nothing else to sense anything from it. So in what way are you a positively charged if there's no such thing as something that can feel charge? In what way are you inertial or material if there's nothing else that can feel that? Okay, fine. We're going to do this rapidly, so we won't explore that, but we can explore it further conceptually to think about oneness dissolving effortlessly into zeroness. But that means, of course, effortlessly you could emerge oneness out of nothingness because it doesn't cost anything to get to something that is the same as the nothingness, perhaps. And then you look at the universe of two-ness, and it's two of those identical things. But if you imagine being one of them, if you imagine not that you're outside the thing, but that this is really all there is, both of them are two instances of exactly the same thing because they're always in the same relative position to each other, right? They can feel the pull of the other one, but there's no up, down, left, right to distinguish which one is in which position. There's no A written on one and B written on another to distinguish them. They're identical and simple. So the two-ness really does dissolve back into oneness. But doesn't that mean that the oneness can emerge effortlessly into two-ness? Perhaps. I don't know, but there's no cost because it's really kind of the same thing. But of course, the oneness dissolves back into the nothingness. You need three things, right? And that's the middle one, the universe of threeness. Just bear with me here. This is conceptually we're going to do a second version of this in a moment. You know, I'm closer to you than I am to that one, right? Now we can start naming and identifying, right? So three things in orbit around each other could be constructed. They could be constructed in an isomorphic kind of in a perfectly balanced way, but they could be constructed, or I think maybe necessarily they're constructed in a way where now you can start to identify things. You don't really have a thing until you've got three. There's a trinity at the base of something meaning something and being conceptually meaningful. Let's say we're not convinced. Let's walk into the next hall. It's the same kind of room, very large. There's three rectangular universes, and there's supposed to be nothing outside them, of course. And then there's one in the middle, just as before. We walk up, we see a plaque. It says the universe of space and time. It rather reminds us of the first aquarium we looked at before. It's nothingness. There's no way to keep time, right? How can you measure time if something isn't oscillating and repeating? But there's no stuff and spaceness distinguished from each other in order to see anything happen or to replicate anything. So I don't know how it has time. Time is meaningless and space is meaningless, even together, unless you have the third component. It's a universe where every location inside it is registering a zero. Then we look at the universe of matter and space. This is the universe where every location registers a one. There's stuff there. For sure, this is stuff. But of course, what is stuff if there's no location that there isn't stuff? There kind of has to be nothingness here and something here for you to be able to conceptually identify that there is a something to begin with. So without, we said it was the universe of space and time. Oh, right. Okay, let's do matter and we'll do space and time last. Let's do matter and I confused myself. We did space and time. Let's do matter and space. Okay. So there's little bits of hard stuff and there's little bits of nothingness space within it, but there's no time, which means the potentiality to move as a particle over time, if there was time, would put the particle in every location, but also in no location because in every one of the locations would not be occupied at some quote unquote time, but all the time is taken away. So there's no distinguishing between those things. So this is the universe where everything registers as a point 0.5. But if everything is one thing and there's no not that thing, it looks a lot like the nothingness universe of all zeros. There's nothing to communicate or to comprehend. And then what's the third one? Let's see here. There's matter and time. That's the universe of all oneness. Like all of the locations register as a one versus a zero in this binary idea, right? So there's matter everywhere, but there's no space. Does that mean that there's stuff? How do you know that there's somethingness unless there's nothingness in some other place? Or right, and again, we're doing this in the most simplistic terms, or we have to, because the stuff we mean isn't this type of atom and that type of atom or anything like that. We just mean registers as mass, registers as the most basic version of being something. So in all three of these, whenever there's two and not the third, you really have a universe of nothing. But then in the middle, you've got the space mass time. Right now, you've got something. So let's take that with a grain of salt, set it aside, and just say there's a reflection of the idea that a world that can be inhabited, that you could thrive in, that creatures could manifest in with aims, a universe that could be conceptualized at all, kind of requires a trinity at the base of its being. So we'll take that idea. I'm going to put a big grain of salt around any ideas that I've developed over my time because they haven't tested anywhere. But let's just assume for a moment that there's something to all of that and say, how did people 100,000 years ago through art and storytelling hit on that? Because all their stories seem to be pointing in that direction. In the beginning, there was God, there was his spirit interested in the chaos and the bubbling potential of what could be, and there was the logos, the communication between the two. And the Christian notion that Peterson's talking about is that in order to have creation, the great I am has to have something else he's interested in, by the way. It isn't an ex nihilo story, which he doesn't talk about and might be heretical, but there's a point in the story at least to consider. But not only that, he has to make himself limited and sacrifice himself. So there's this verse that says Christ was crucified at the foundations of being. Now, we're not trying to say that was code for this other stuff I'm talking about. We're trying to talk about it in a way where we can say, oh, I think it means at least that much, right? So none of this is to reduce the Bible. We're going to talk about the difference between signs and symbols in a moment, where we say the point is not to say, oh, flower equals this and island equals this. So we can just decode it. And now we've got a different type of language that just tells us matter of factly what it is. That's not the nature of the stories. They're coming from, and this was why he was making the Jungian point, they're coming from the dream world of ideas that are not yet articulatable, that we're trying to extract something that propositional out of it. But we remember that this is so deeply profound that we're not going to sum it up and say, okay, now you don't need to read the Bible, just listen to this. No, it means more than that. It means at least this much, right? So we're grasping at trying to figure out its meaning here, but we're not reducing it. But in any event, at least it seems on a philosophical level that what's being talked about here is something like you have two things: the source of potentiality, which means nothingness, but a weird kind of nothingness because it's trying to be. So it's a nothingness aimed at being. And then you have the great I am that is being. And you have the dance between the two. You have the logos communication between the two, but you need that thing in order to make it possible. And it says, for God so loved the world. The word so is a Greek word that translated for God in this manner loved the world. This is how he loved the world, that he would become limited and torn apart. To understand limitation and to be interested in it is what his project was from the beginning. And that it's the dance and marriage between these two things that is all that we are. That's the answer for creation. Now, maybe we're misreading the story, but the story seems to be saying at least that much. And that's a pretty profound set of things for, a lot of times people like say, oh, a bunch of goat herders who didn't know anything about science. What were they talking about? It seems more impressive when we think about it in these other ways. All right. So he talks about the logos, not just in history, outside space and time. Being depends. All right. So he's going to talk in this lens again of as a psychologist. So being depends on consciousness. Consciousness performs a constitutive role for all being, a constituent element in reality. So back to the phenomenology, back to the idea that consciousness plays a role. One of the things he said was we think about the vastness of the universe and our conclusion is the facts are telling us we're insignificant specks on an insignificant speck out in some suburb of a not that impressive galaxy amongst billions. Okay, that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is the number of neurological connections in your brain outnumber the stars, I think by an order of magnitude. We'll have to look that up and make sure I'm not misspeaking or I heard some nonsense and repeated it. It certainly by orders of magnitude outnumbers the information containable in your genetic code, but that's a different topic. Maybe the universe has to be that big for the sorts of consciousness that have a divine spark in them in order to be equalized. It's another way of thinking about it. In any event, he's saying, he's not saying, "Hey, God equals consciousness." He's not saying that. He's saying there's a truth about the way in which we as conscious creatures come to make sense of the world, that we have to name things, that there's a logos principle involved in making a world that's orderable. There's experiments that psychologists have done. I'll give you an example. I think there was one. I don't know if you could get ethical approval for doing this nowadays. If I remember correctly, there was one who took two identical twin cats or something like that, and they put one in a harness so it could walk around the room, it could see things, and it could interact with its environment. And they hooked it up to a a winch, not a winch, a lever, a stick that had the identical cat suspended so that it couldn't walk and couldn't interact with its environment. So for all the time that the one cat is learning things and interacting its environment, the other cat has an equal amount of visual and auditory stimuli coming into its brain. They take the second cat out and it can't even walk. It has no idea how to navigate the world. It's been watching a movie, but it hasn't been embodying the reality. Okay? It doesn't have a map of the world on its spinal column. Okay? So when we say we're going to try to understand astrophysics, we're going to try to understand geology and chemistry and physics, we're trying to make sense of the world. When we try to navigate the world with engineering and physics in that sense, we're trying to predict, measure, manipulate, interact with the world. But our concepts of a world are dependent upon our embodiment and the stuff that our brain is doing to make categories of things as useful, obstacles, non-interesting, or not yet interesting, not yet obstacles or tools, and things that are in the way of our progression or are aiding us. So tools and obstacles and things like that. Peterson will talk about this again in another section, so we won't belabor it too much. But the idea is that we think of our brain as here. This he might have talked about this, but here's an idea. We think of our brain as in our skull, and then our bodies. And we got a body and we got a brain. It might be more accurate to think of our brain as distributed throughout our body, and that our body is in. He talks about, well, I know he's going to talk about this more later, so we won't go into it right now because I know we have a lot to cover. But starting with embodied, starting with the material and then the behavioral and then the dream image impression of what it is we're doing with our behavioral code. And then there's the language of argument and proposition. And then within that, there might be a scientific, descriptive, formulaic understanding. But if this is the way that it's stacked, he's comprehending it that way and saying, okay, let's use that understanding to know why we should go to the scriptures. They're in this dream Jungian world. They're going to tell us about the things that are deepest and most profound, but they're going to have to be we're not going to be able to say we understand it. We're going to have to try to extract it and wrestle with it and say it's something like this. And let's go back to it again because it's not reducible to formulas that you could write in a text, but we're going to try to extract as much as we can in that direction. Uh, let's move on. I know I'm going back to stuff that I said I was going to skip. Uh, so he's talking about our consciousness and Dostoevsky. All right, what is God? So this was what he just talked about. So we won't have to look at this again right now, although it's fun. Let's move on to these notes here. Okay, these are designed to try to answer some of the questions that were happening in the after conversation, which were all really good questions. And one of the main focuses of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to understand how is Peterson approaching these things? How is he approaching it in a cultural context? Is he outside of time doing it? Is it like a grander way of approaching these things? Let me shut this off. That might make things go faster. Okay. So let's talk about a few of the things that are starting to emerge that we can pick up on, right? So it's not like he's explicitly saying this. We're going to try to say it seems like Peterson's doing this, and well, he said this, but he also said that. So we don't want, when you hear somebody say one thing, you can believe an absolute version of it, but then he qualified it with this opposite principle. So how does he balance them together? So the significance of mythopoetic scriptures in general. The material reality is the background for the world of living creatures. The behavioral world of living creatures is the background for the dreams. The dream world is the place where the mystics and the artists live. This is the place inhabited by the mythopoetic artistic representations to tell us about who we are, what world we live in, the nature of the divine, and everything else that we have to relate to. Remember, it's in narrative form, the dreams. And so everything starts characterologically. It's not presuming everything is made of objects, it's presuming everything is relatable to a personality. Well, you are a personality, and it makes sense to try to make sense of the world that way. So, in our post scientism era, we like to imagine, even though we don't, we like to imagine that we think objectively about things and that that's the best way to think about them. But you are a person, and those objects have to mean something to you as a person. So, the existentialists and the phenomenologists and the pragmatists, uh, all again, this is in the context of what is Nietzsche doing and what are we doing after to make sense of it. They're all saying, now, wait a minute, you guys are throwing out the baby and the bathwater and everything else, and just a world of facts isn't going to be a world that we can understand. But we do have richness over here. So let's go dive into the art and realize that it doesn't just feel profound and meaningful. It's not just a diversion because it's entertaining. The reason it feels profound and meaningful, even though we can't articulate what it means to us, is that it is profound and meaningful. Maybe we can have some ears to hear and some humility in the way we approach it. So this is all of his argument for why it's necessary and for why it's appropriate to approach the scriptures in this way. The philosophical, propositional, analytic, dialectic, that stuff is about the truths, is rooted in all of this, which is more foundational. And then the scientific, okay, I've said all this. Okay. Therefore, to read a book solely as a source of objectivist data collection, to read this book solely as that, is to be inclined to miss the point of the story. It would be like questioning the historical reality of a detail in King Lear instead of getting the meaning of the story. But it also means that speaking accurately, so there's a flip side to this, and he understands both. To speak accurately about the meaning in the realm of propositional statements, to use words like that, which could be true or false, is difficult and ultimately probably not a project which can be completed, which is good news. It's an infinite source of greater profundity and depth. It's akin to the mistake of saying, I really love and care about my spouse. She is basically she could never surprise me. I'm running her like a subroutine on my operating system. She's like a 1990s uh, operating system, and I know everything she's gonna say and everything she's gonna do. It's like, first of all, you don't. Secondly, isn't that great? Thirdly, if you say that to her in the next week, you're gonna be pretty goddamn surprised. I can guarantee you that, and she's not gonna be too happy with you when you say it. But fourthly, isn't it great that you can always have greater intimacy? So there's a relational aspect to the way that the mythopoets are understanding the proper way for us to conceptualize is relational. Nature is personified. You think about the Greek gods, right? Oh, how silly. They didn't understand how the wind blew. It's like, they understood how to think scientifically more than you think. They weren't as interested in that. They weren't as interested in that. They wanted to know how to relate to nature, qua nature on the grand scale, and then through the smaller scales. They wanted to know how to relate to the divine. They wanted to know how to relate to the body politic, how to relate to the familial. They wanted all on all levels. It starts in narrative, it starts characterologically, and it's all relational, and also to relate to the text. So it's as we're wrestling with the text in this different kind of a way, it's sort of one half of the relationship, and where maybe we could, and the same with God, right? It's like the We Who Wrestle with God is his new book that came out. Of course, Israel means those who wrestle with God, and the idea is like, wait a minute, this conception of God is someone who the the patriarch in the line of God's project, the heavenly kingdom project on earth, the manifestation of that sort of royal position is learning a lot of karmic lessons about deceptive ways of trying to get there alternatively in your own power, and then is wrestling with God and trying to dislocate his leg to get a blessing. I will not let you go until you bless me. I think his leg got dislocated, but he's wrestling with God. It's not like a, he is all and I am nothing. It's more like a, let's see how, let's work this out, right? And Peterson says in the answer to the first question, you said chaos is that which you confront and slay, but you also said it's that which you make the world out of. And what do you mean by that? And Peterson jumped on it. He goes, you make your marriage out of the arguments. Okay. The chaos bubbles up. We don't understand what's going on with you. Why are you reacting this way? We talk it out and we figure it out. And then we have an understanding. We have a space where it's like, okay, holy cow, we just dug out something really deep and we figured this out. And now we have a way of relating to each other. So and moving forward. So the home is built out of the arguments. It's an interesting idea. In any event, our the scripture is talking to us as if that's our relationship with the divine. All right, we'll have plenty of opportunity to read the stories and see that, but um it also means that speaking accurately, so it's not something reducible to formulas or to get the truth right in a way where this statement is what it was about and now we don't have to look at it again. It's like, no, go back and find a deeper truth about it. And it's, you knew it was true there, but you've never done this before and it's true in this way. And the times are changing and the chaos, which is a part of making things up, means the environment is changing. These things need to be constantly updated. And we'll see that Nietzsche had that notion as well, although most people miss that. Um, in any event, I'm going to try to not go on too many tangents here because we have a lot to cover here. This is an explanation for why, when one goes back to the stories again, there is also something more to learn, and it offers an explanation of why we can detect that there is something deeply, profoundly meaningful. All right, so it's an explanation for both of those things. I've been talking about it at length. It also, although rapidly, it is also based on the Jungian idea that the dream is trying to communicate something to us which is not yet articulable by us. Okay, so I've been repeating this as we go, so we don't have to go down the rabbit hole again here. But um, we're collecting this is how Peterson is conceptualizing his being in the world and how he can approach the scriptures to say, tell me something about how I should be aimed in a certain direction or what I should be aimed at or how I should progress to get to that aim. And he's understanding it in that characterological art perspective with the justification from Jung and Nietzsche, the existentialist, William James, the pragmatist, to say this would be the proper way to do this. Remember when Christ said, for those who have ears, let them hear. It's like, this isn't something you can just take literally. It's too deep for that. Now, the fundamentalists would say, but wait a minute, what matters to me is that it's literally true. I'm right. I live in this world where that type of truth is the ultimate truth. Are you saying it's not that? You're taking it away. It's like, well, okay, maybe not, because we certainly, and this is important to notice, he hasn't said it's not literally true. Peterson has never said that. Listen carefully for him to say that. He doesn't say it. This is why I loved when he first came out, because I was like, I know what's going to happen. The atheists are going to think he's a fundamentalist Christian, and the fundamentalist Christians are going to think he's an atheist. And if you want a sign of if you want one of the signs of a really good thinker, you should pay attention to, it's somebody who both sides are really hateful of or skeptical of. In any event, there were a lot of things about Peterson that catch the attention of people who say, "All right, this is a thinker. This is an individual to pay attention to." All right. In any event, what you could say is, look, okay, if you're hung up on the idea as a Dawkinite that this book is not literally true, maybe my response to you could be, of course it's not literally true. Look how much more profoundly true it is than that. And if you're hung up on the idea of saying it needs to be literally true, we must be doing our analysis of isotopes and radioactive decay wrong because the Bible has to be exactly 6,000 years old or the world has to be exactly 6,000 years old because that's what the Bible says. Maybe the response would be, of course, it's literally true. Look at how much more profoundly true it is than that. Okay. So he's actually not offering an answer to the question, is it literally true or not literally true? He does. There are some things he says which would qualify the last statement I just made, where he's going to talk about not saying things that are outrageous to reason or that that go against empirical consequences and studies, but he also has a lot of qualifiers on how much do we really know what we think we know scientifically. And so all of that's still open and he's not getting into it. But what I'm offering as a response to both of those is to highlight the main point of saying, let's approach it this way and see what we get out of it. And then maybe we'll just suspend our talk about the literal truth of it without making a judgment for now. Okay, the dream world is written to. All right, so we won't get into this. Um, okay, so once again, there's matter. The matter has the world of characters, of creatures. They have behaviors and behavioral patterns. They have actions. That's a realm. Within that realm, there's then the impressions of the patterns of those. He likes to use patterns, so I should use it more when talking about this idea. The patterns of the ways of being start to become, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Concretized is the wrong thing. We start to get a vague imagistic uh grasp of the sort of patterns of ways of being that seem to be defining the types of people that exist and the ways that we have that we are relating to these other things of nature and every and God and everything else. And that's all in this Jungian subconscious. And then the dreams are trying to tell us things we need to hear, but it's also the dream world is the realm of the artist and the inspired and the people connected to the muse and those of revelation. So this language of mythopoetry, he's looking at scriptural texts as emerging out of that type of place and saying, okay, understand it in other ways or don't. You can take poop throwing, rock wielding apes and make them cathedral builders and pyramid builders if only they will spend 100,000 years orienting themselves around these stories, or maybe even just 1,000 years, or maybe even just 100. But they were orienting themselves around these stories for all the time that they were civilized. And so, civilization and paying attention to what's being said to us that isn't stuff that we comprehend and can articulate, that's coming first. Now let's try to articulate it. Let's try to see what it tells us. And of course, the Bible has philosophy, it has history, it has other sections that are doing those things. But let's approach the narrative as if it's trying to tell us, or no, as if it's in a privileged place to talk to us about the types of personal forces that make up our reality. Here's something I don't think I made slides on, but let's talk about the ancient Greek for a minute to illustrate that a little bit more. Peterson talked about rage and lust and things like that. Actually, you know what? I think I talked about this in one of the other classes or the after conversation. But if there are ways of being, and if you are constituted of subpersonalities, as Nietzsche, as Jordan Peterson is talking about, and that if they're at war with each other, that's a psychological ill health. But if they're properly organized, that's like Zeus with a proper kingdom. And yeah, there's these different personalities with their own wills and historical interests, but they're in the right place. Apollo doesn't help out over here, but he's real good over here, and they're relating properly. That's like getting your house in order. It could be, again, we're not reducing the Greek mythology to it was a story about our psychology. We're saying it seems to be pointing at least that much. And of course, there's a question that might emerge. Well, how could it be that a story about a dude and a rock and a thing like that could be about psychology, and it could be about international politics, and it could be saying the same thing in both, and it could be about how could it be all of those things? Right? That's a real question. The answer might just be we're talking about the source of all things. This is creation. Why are you surprised that everything reflects it? Oh, now we can look at different levels of analysis. Now we can get down to the subatomic and the intergalactical or the international political. And we can look at all these things and say, oh, look, the same story does apply to them all because everything is a reflection of the source of all being. If it is a source, if there is a source and you're getting a picture of what it's like in personal terminology and in artistic form, why should you be surprised? That's an interesting suggestive answer to a question that might not even be clear until we take a course like Peterson's. Okay, so let's move on. Who are the archetypes? Back to Jung again. They're personalities, ways of being that are immortal, basic, definitive of your life and can control you. So these are some of the things that he was talking about or hinting at. Okay, the Jungian archetypes. The idea is you can't get beneath them. There's maybe you can find the grandfather deities and say order and chaos or something like that. But these deities, these personal forces of being, they define what you are and they can possess you, right? You live and die. All right. So here's an example. When somebody goes into a rage and they come out of it, you're like, what happened to you, man? Well, you come out of a rage. I can't believe I did that. Well, how is it that you can do things that aren't what you want to do and aren't an expression of your will? Also, a person in a rage doesn't look like themselves. They look rather like any other person in the moment that that person's in a rage. It might be, it's almost as if the easiest, most direct, and most accurate way of describing who you are and what world you inhabit is that there are personalities that float above you that can possess you. There are ways of being that you live and die, but this thing is immortal. It continues. It's a suggestion. You are made up of these subpersonalities, and this is Peterson again. If your house is not in order, if these entities are not relating to one another properly and each bringing what they bring to the proper place, then the gods are at war. And this could be a way of thinking of psychological ill health or well-being, but it's not reduced to that. But Peterson's a psychologist, and he's going to be giving us an awful lot of really cool psychological insights. But he's not saying, "Oh, the Bible is just psychological or it's just to be read in this way." But the class is the psychological significance of the biblical stories, and so he's going to be using that one lens often. Um, you might imagine a geologist adopting the Jungian perspectives and then trying to understand the story of how the Earth took its present form. We'll put that aside. We need to know what stories we inhabit. We all right, so this is again Jung. We act things out, we imagine what we act out. The dream is taking us talking to us about these patterns. We're saying this again. The artist gets the revelation and because it's something that they've not because it's something they've come to consciously, but they've become aware of it only after reflecting on the artistic dream revelation as given. All right. So we are doing the same by going back to okay, so good. So the artist, he's trying to talk about revelation. And again, it's not a reductivist story to say revelation is just exactly this. What he's saying is here's a story. Again, so here's something we might illustrate. Peterson is talking to a very broad audience. He's aware of what he's doing, obviously, but what he's doing is heroically, it's a heck of a thing to accomplish. He's saying, I'm going to justify that there's truth and meaning in these stories. And then I'm going to talk to everybody from a fundamentalist Christian to a science worshiping denier of anything that's not objective. The statements I make should be acceptable to both of them. They should be true and meaningful and valuable to their lives. And I'm not reducing what I'm talking about to the framework of either one of them. It's a hell of an accomplishment. It's really a heck of an accomplishment because when Peterson's talking about these mythological stories and the things that people regard as scripture, first of all, I'm not saying he doesn't regard them as scripture, but he's talking about these things in a way that he could get away with saying it in front of academic peers who are completely anti-theistic or atheistic, which is annoying if what you want to do is have if you want to have these simple camps and say we're going to fight with each other. Both camps should dislike Peterson and think that he's on the other side at first until they do something to try to figure out what he's actually doing here. It's amazing. Likewise, if the artist is in touch with these forms directly and then has a way of depicting them in sculpture or in painting or in story so that we can immediately interact with them, and we'll talk about that again in a moment, what are we doing when we go back and meditate on the stories or stand in front of the statues or think about what the painting is saying to us without reducing it to just simple propositions but experiencing it in that relational way? Well, we're getting in touch with those exact same things that artist, the better dreamer, the inspired, the anointed, the one who is connected to the muses, whatever language we want to use, what they're doing. It's like they're seeing a more clear dream than you've ever had, and then they're allowing you to participate with the characters and the forms of that dream. And again, in our post-Cartesian scientism, worshiping the objective as if it's more, if less fictional and more accurate or something like that, we have a hard time as fundamentalists have a hard time, especially saying, well, that's all the Bible is. Well, what do you mean all it is? Right. So there's an inversion of the valuation there where to the Jungians, it's like, you can't get deeper than that. You go ahead and try. Give me a formula. Give me an equation that's telling me more about reality than that. The equation's super useful. What a nice tool. Uh, the star will be in this location in space because of the formula of the ellipse at time t, given this other time and location here, and this other one too. Congratulations, you've figured out a lot about the world. As Nietzsche pointed out, why don't you go walk up to the star? Why don't you go tell the star about the dark areas of space that it will soon be inhabiting and see if that means a fucking goddamn thing to the star? Not that you're wrong, not that your formula is wrong, but what about being in the universe? What about realizing that you're inescapably in the universe? What about the consequences for our science when we start to realize that the act of observing disturbs the observed and we're not actually outside the universe? And how far is this language going to take us? Well, we're there now, but Nietzsche understood it before. And also some ancient Greeks understood it before too, which we'll have a chance to look at. Okay, let's move on. How do the artists do what they do? We've read Ion, we've read Plato. There's lots we could talk about, but let's just focus on what Nietzsche, what Jordan Peterson is highlighting here. They pay attention to the pattern. So this is his story. They're paying attention to the patterns of reality around them, the natural, social, political, biological, geological, all of the patterns. And then they tell stories that represent the ways we behave in the world. They detect subconsciously, probably, these patterns and get in touch with them, like the forms, and then they depict them for us symbolically. An abstraction of the patterns are then shown to us in the art we see. We see ourselves in a mirror. What's that quote from Hamlet? The purpose of playing, right? Being an actor and playing in a drama. The purpose of playing were to hold the nature up to mirror, or hold the mirror up to nature, to show I can't remember the quote, to show virtue its own form, rage its own image, or something like that, right? To hold the image, the mirror up to nature. It speaks to us about who we are and what we are up to and what personalities constitute our surroundings. Get It gets the signal out of the noise is how he put it, and then we can talk about what the meaning of the story is. All right, so that's what we're going to do. Right, we're going to try to talk about what the story means, but he's approaching it with this deep humility that says it means more than anything we say, and we can go back to it and get more meaning later. You just rest assured, this is bottomless. But we're gonna try. We're gonna try to talk about what it means. That's worthwhile too, doing philosophy and doing argument and thinking things out, and but also leaving the realm of philosophy into diving in with Jung into this crazy ocean of the dream world where the rules of time and space don't exactly apply. And well, let's go. Let's see if we can be anchored in a way where we can go there because there's something valuable. This is Peterson talks about descending into the abyss to rescue your father from the whale. Okay. He's talking about it, revealing that the text is talking about it, and also doing it at the same time. This is an accomplishment. Okay. Then we can talk about what the meaning of the story is. This puts us in the space of Homer. Okay, so what now I highlight, so I added this thing about Homer. So when you've got the story and it's your reality and you're orienting yourself around it, and then 250,000 years of successful civilization is made possible, that's one thing. But when you start talking about it, when you start saying, "Do we have it right? Let's tweak it a little bit. Oh, we all died. Okay, well, maybe we won't adopt this other tribe's slightly different version. Maybe we'll stick with ours. Maybe we'll war it out to see who's got it correct. Maybe we will adopt this. Oh, that's a pretty good idea. Look, they're thriving pretty well and they've got a slightly different version of the story, right? So while we're doing all of that, before we get into consciously trying to say, okay, could I construct a story that would give me truth, right? That's literature, right? This is like meta literature. In the Peterson's talk about it is he says, what if you abstracted what was meaningful and true about your life and everybody else's life, and then you've got sort of like the Hamlet or the King Lear story that just seems to apply to everybody because you've gotten rid of the particulars and you did that abstraction. Well, what if you did that with all of the best abstractions? Now you've got something like the God of the Bible, like the Christ story, like the Socratic story, which is a Christ story, right? But now you've got something like a mythopoetic character, right? So he does talk about it that way. But what about Homer? Homer's sort of half in the realm of telling a story, but also half in the realm of thinking about how to construct it consciously. Now, one of the other points of humility is to say, I'm an individual who hasn't lived 200,000 years being successful civilizations and failing civilizations. My ability to create a story is like nothing compared to the ones that have been handed down to us by the only people paying enough attention to actually thrive in that horrifying milieu that was our past. It was really difficult, right? We get in a time machine, we go back there. You and I are not living a week. You take somebody from that time who's one of the leaders of one of these tribes, you bring him here, he's gonna learn an iPad in a second, and he's probably gonna take over the world in a year or 2. Like, these are people who are paying such ridiculous careful attention to who they are and what world they live in, and it's being depicted in art. It's not philosophical at that point. Part of it is. There is philosophy being done back then, but these stories, the narrative part of these stories are depictions of what it is the images that they've interacted with that seem to be that are their best depictions of what the archetypes actually are, the foundational, right? The arche is the thing that comes before it all. So we're talking about origins and all of being again. So the archetype is the thing that's getting as close to the big bang of this consciousness creation thing that you can get to talk about the Jungian notion again. Okay. But then if you're but then you say, well, okay, but literature's worth something and it's valuable and we should try to do it better. It's like, yeah, absolutely. It's a great discipline. We're not saying, oh, throw it all out, just read the Bible or just read Ovid's Metamorphoses or just read books like that or something. What we're saying is let's put them in the context of understanding what they are in relation to these things and then say, okay, what about the author who is dreaming and getting impressions? We read a little Salman Rushdie the other day as a part of are just a spin-off of what we're eventually going to do in a literature series. But uh, Salman Rushdie talked once about, he started the very book that we were reading. He started it and he had an idea of what the ending was going to be. And when he got to it, he couldn't write it. And the way he put it is the characters insisted on a different ending. I don't think he was making a joke. Okay. If you think that language like that from artists is a joke, I think you don't understand how these things are working. The characters were like living, they had a place, they were living, they had the ending that was appropriate that they would only play out. He couldn't write it until he wrote it differently. I d- it would be very silly to imagine that he was 100% joking and there wasn't some truth to that. That's what it's like for these people. Okay. So, in any event, even the artists today, they're still getting in touch. I mean, the art isn't something different. It's not like I sat and I came up with. I mean, that's just propaganda, right? I came up with the message I wanted to give and a way of attracting people to it, and I made art. No, you fucking didn't. You made propaganda, and it's not going to last, and nobody wants to look at it. But if you're making art, if you're making something where it's like, I can't tell you why this means something to me, but holy shit, this feels profound, you got to be in touch with the muses. That's how the Greeks put it. Okay. So let's make this note about symbol versus sign for a moment, because the Jungian and Peterson's going to say symbolic a lot. What's the difference between symbol and sign? It's worth talking about. Words mostly are like signs. Are there signs? Chair, hat, indefatigability, conclusions, tree. These are words that point to something other than what they are. They contain mostly nothing of the thing they are. This is why different languages have arbon or tree, like different words for tree in different languages can be referring and pointing to something else. The symbolic is not like that. Symbols contain something of the very nature of the thing to which they are pointing. So when Jordan Peterson says the artist abstracts out the pattern and then represents, I'm imitating him because of that part of the video. Yeah, I was just doing the hand gesture. The artist abstracts out the pattern and then represents it to us symbolically. He means that we're being presented face to face with the actual something of the actual nature and character of these fundamentally real things. This is Jungian. This is this is this is where this distinction comes from. So, people have seen this before, but maybe somebody hasn't. Last night, I personally was visited by an alien from a small globe surrounding the star of Sirius. And he shared with me some of his language and the letters that they use to write their books. And I remember two of them. One was called Kiki, and the other letter was called Boo Boo. I think I can draw them for you here. Savad, which one is Kiki and which one is Boo Boo?
I would assume in the order that you read them in, that Boo Boo's the second one
Because I read them in that order or because of the symbols?
because you read them in that order, not because of the
Ah,
symbol.
so there's nothing about these symbols. Let's go back. Uh, one was called Boo Boo and the other one was called Kiki. I think I can draw them for you here. Which one's Boo Boo and which one's Kiki? Which one's Kiki and which one's Boo Boo? I'm not hinting. I'm just trying to negate the fact that I set them in an order.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
You wouldn't know. You're being put
There's
on the
any
spot.
significance to either.
How would
Yeah.
anybody know which one's Kiki and which one's Boo Boo? This is like a trick question or something. Okay, but you've got $1 million and you have to bet. You just have to bet. I want you to bet right now which one of these two is Kiki versus Boo Boo.
We'll go with the first one.
Yeah. The first one's Kiki. I mean, these don't exist. There's no wrong answer, obviously, but
Right. Sure.
there kind of is a right answer, isn't there? Maybe you don't feel it as much. 90 something percent of people say that the first one is Kiki and the second one is Boo Boo. We're not negating our point about language and words being signs. There's something of the quality of roundness and boo-boo-ness in one of these more than the other. There's sort of the hard, sharp sounding of kikiness in one of these rather than the other. Maybe that's not as impressive a demonstration to you, but in a large group of people, almost everybody's like, yeah, the first one's Kiki, the second one's Boo Boo. And it's that connection to there's something of kikiness in one. If one of them has to be Kiki and one of them has to be Boo Boo, there's something of kikiness in the first that's not in the second. There's something of boo boo-ness. Now, these words don't mean anything, and the symbols aren't actual letters, of course, which is why it's a powerful demonstration of the fact that there's between different senses there's so the artist, it's argued, is able to give us in statue form or in painting form something of the actual character of the thing that is trying to be represented. You're interacting with it directly to some degree through the art. So anyway, that's an idea. Okay, thank you for being willing to answer a ridiculous question that has no right answer. Officially, but it kind of does. Okay. The story has to be approached with the appropriate respect. We've hinted at this and talked about it a bit. The world of our ancestors was rougher than you can imagine. Those who thrived left us stories of how they saw the world. This is all stuff that's just contained in his first 2-hour lecture, besides the fact that he was talking about all these other thinkers and all those other notes we skipped by quickly. Okay. Those who thrived left us stories of how they saw the world. The stories that we have are of those who survived and thrived in that harsh milieu. If cultures and civilizations could develop from, okay, I've used my language to describe this before, so we're saying it again, through constant meditation, built upon and building through the calendar, every part of your day in your calendar is built around these stories. They're what tell you what time it is and what season it is. And they're in the architecture and they're in absolutely everything. It's like it's not clear that we have this idea that we eventually hit upon some scientific notions and developed agriculture to the point that we had a caloric surplus, and then we could sit around and imagine things. And it's all the surplus value of our imagination. This other way of looking at it is like, no, no, no. Every building that was built, every successful cave tribe was full of statues and paintings. Okay. They go together. You need the one. You need to dream properly about who you are and what you are to consider what you need to consider that would help you to navigate the world properly in order to do these things that are not just ape-like. Okay. That being the case, we might just pay some attention to them and not assume that they are dumb old stories, but perhaps that they contain within them the very content which we require to remain sane and civilized. Something like that. So we're just trying to answer questions from the after conversations that we've been having about who is this Peterson guy and what is he up to? Okay, and how is he going about it? So what constitutes our reality? So Peterson's perspective that's starting to emerge here. He's got books on it. Oh, we're going to fix this tech issue in a moment. Is that working? It's going to work in a moment. Give me some audio to let me know that you're back in. We're going to try.
Oh,
Oh,
yep,
there
I'm
you
here.
Okay, good. All right, we got you back. Okay. So this is starting to emerge in the first video. It's going to emerge more. He's written his book on maps of meaning and everything. But for Peterson, the cosmos on the sort of the most zoomed out you can get is a dance. So there's three things. It's the dance and the relationship between order and chaos. The great grandparents of these two major deities, I'm sorry, the great grandparents of the major deities and the lesser ones are depicted in traditionally masculine and feminine depictions as sort of these great grandmother deity and great grandfather deity, or in the scriptures as the the spirit of God hovering over the chaotic waters, like interested in helping it to become what it has the potential to become. And there's the communication logos between them. The stories depict that which we do not understand and the models we impose upon the world. Okay, that which we do not understand is the realm of chaos, the models we impose upon the world. Now, one of the things to understand, and this is really cool. I didn't make slides for this, but we're going to talk about it. These personalities, these archetypal personalities that have been suggested to be at the base of being and define everything that you are and everything that is. Sometimes people ask the question, well, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy? You know, is Apollo good or is he bad? Is Mars good or bad? It's like good for what? Bad for what? Good in what context? He's good for this. He's not so good over here. This is the proper place for this. This is wrong over here. These two are going to fight with each other, but if they work it out and there's the proper order, then that's what's good. Something like that. So the chaos is the realm of that which we do not understand. It's usually depicted in feminine artistic depictions. That's mother nature. When you're born, you don't understand shit. You don't even know that you need to eat to live, but there's this breast and you're being suckled and you're sucking at this breast. It's like you don't understand anything, but it's giving you. It's the fruit that's growing on the trees in the garden that you don't cultivate and develop a science for understanding. It's just available. It's just there. It's just you don't get it, but here it all is. That's mother nature. That's the good side. She can get angry. She can be unhappy. She's also the source of chaos, of dragons. She's the source of predation. When you're in the woods and you don't understand, things can live off of you. You might be fodder. You're the fruit that the wolf is eating. And isn't Mother Nature so nice to present you as fruit? The wolf didn't plan on herding you into the woods, but here you are. And you're pretty yummy, right? So it's not good and it's not bad. It's real and it's dangerous. And not knowing that it's real and how to relate to it properly is really dangerous. But knowing what she's like and what she contributes to and whether or not it's the balance is maintained, and that could be very useful, right? So we want to understand her not as good or bad, but as real and someone with whom you have to figure out how to relate properly. The other side, the traditionally depicted as masculine side, that's culture in part. Well, it's not reduced to that, but Peterson talks about it. It's the walls, it's the streets, it's the lines, it's the definition, it's the structures and the institutions that stave off the predators, that say, hey, you're safe inside this house, and here's what defines you and where you are. It tells you who you are. Pretty useful, pretty nice. Nice to not live naked in the woods like the apes where, anything can eat me at any time, but I also have things to eat, so I'm happy right now and I'm not later and whatever. It's just, I have no understanding of the future. I haven't fallen out of paradise like Adam and Eve. We'll get to the stories. Pretty nice. That's really helpful. It invents medicine. It develops uh, imperial structures of military and supreme courts and symphonic non-lyrical orchestras, and this stuff's pretty good. He's also the Jupiter that eats his children when they don't conform to what it is that he wanted them to be. He's also the tyrant. He's also the judge. He's dangerous. He's the thing that, he's defined you. You exist too, and there's a wrestling relationship here. It's not just all him telling you what you are in that sense, but not being concerned with that personality and thinking it doesn't matter. Okay, go live naked as a hippie in the woods. You'll have a great time. You'll die of some horrible disease and there won't be anything to help you. And that's all great. You get the positives and the negatives of purely living in the world that you don't understand. live in the world of purely we've defined everything and we know what it all means and it follows these rules and we've got it is living in a totalitarian, stifling place. Paradiso, paradise, means walled garden. The walls are built too stringently, nothing can grow. No walls at all, the elephants are trampling the flowers, right? So this isn't good and it isn't bad. This isn't good and it isn't bad. These are realities that together, if they're in proper relationship, which is always evolving and we're trying to update to make it relevant and figure out what the proper dance is with new challenges. But those two constitute what you are and what everything else is. Okay. So we're just going to talk about Peterson's conception of his mythopoetic conception of reality, and he goes back to this: order and chaos are the two main things. They're the grandfather and grandmother deities behind it all. Again, that's a conceptual idea. He's not saying, I'm going to invent a new religion or something like that. He's saying, I think I'm extracting this idea from the scriptures and from these other stories and whatever. This happens to be the way he thinks about it. Now, again, if this is the source of all being, it shouldn't surprise us. There are two hemispheres in your brain, one of which makes models of things and is cognitively blind to anything that doesn't fit its model. If you're living in only that world, you will bump your head into the wall repeatedly until you die if your model is there is no wall here. It doesn't have the ability on its own to update its model of reality. It imposes it on things. And then there's the other part of your brain, and Peterson will talk about this. So you can activate it, he says, by sticking your hand in the open door of a dark room and then just watching what your imagination does. What's about to eat my hand? There's some weird dragon monster that's about to eat my hand. Like, where the fuck is that coming from? You're not seeing it. It's not picking up on, sensory input. This is the part of your brain that says, I don't know what's going on. Let me make as many models as I could possibly can about what might be going on. The communication between the two is what's necessary. You try to make a model. This is Peterson for sure. You go into the chaos that you don't understand. You try to throw a conceptual net around it. You try to cut it into pieces. You try to make sense of it, and then you build a model that makes sense of it, and that works for a while. But it's a map. It's a model. It's an approximation. It's not everything. It works for a while, but you get ossified and you think it's everything, and you try to impose it and say it will never fail. The chaos has more surprises for you. Stuff's going to happen and it ain't going to work. So what you have to do is communicate between the two. As soon as I've got a model, I think I've got it understood. Let me desperately find anything that doesn't fit this model so I can tear it down and build an even better one. What happens when I'm in the chaos? Let me try to make a model out of it. And it's just always constantly going back and forth. We're like living in the line between the yin and the yang. This is all Peterson. I'm adding some. He's talked a bit about this. It'll emerge more. I'm talking a bit about from his book, um, Maps of Meaning. This is I might be inaccurate a little bit. This is my best depiction without notes of this is sort of the way he conceptualizes the being. Okay. The communication between them, the dance is another way of thinking about the psychological health. Everything is made up of this relationship. Something like that. Now, again, if it's everything, it should apply to more than just psychology, but he's a psychologist. He's going to show how it applies there, but he's also talking about it in these other contexts as well. Okay, so he had talked about Marduk, right? There's Apsu and Tiamat. That's order and chaos. Maybe he says locked in an eternal embrace. The gods, the children of this embrace, kill their father. There's no more order, and now it's chaos run amok. And then how do we deal with that? Well, there's a god born to them with attention, with eyes around his head, right? So one of the other things to do from the Jungian keys is that when you approach the story, you say eyes around the head. That means something, right? It's not arbitrary. It's not just, well, the cigar is just a cigar right now. It's no, there's something of the reality that I'm supposed to get in the symbols itself. So we'll talk more about the ways to approach them and not just make it make anything or mean anything. There's other Jungian keys that will emerge as we continue to go, like um, take the deity and say, oh, he's got all these different things about him. Find the one thing that's common. That's what he really is. Right. So with Apollo, he's the god of medicine. He's the god of non-lyrical symphonic music, like numerical type music. He's the god of empire. He's the god. He's clearly the god. He's a Marduk. He's a version of a Marduk, and his attempt to tame Daphne puts him in his place and he learns what his limits are. This is the right way of approaching everything. Make it a game, figure it out, and thrive. Everything except there's a higher principle that flies above you. It's called Cupid. There's a love thing. If you're treating people in relationships that way, you're about to meet a really bad end, even if you're Apollo himself. Well, again, we won't talk about the whole story, but that's partly what the story's saying. So, in any event, Peterson is seeing this as how do we make a habitable world? A Nazi totalitarian regime is not livable. A hippie communist, let's all starve to death and just trust nature to provide for us is not livable. Okay, so if both extremes are not livable, what else do we have? Well, we have the not extremes, but that requires their opposite principle. That requires balance. That requires, well, we need some rules. The rules can't define us. They're for us, not us for them, right? We need to constantly be challenging and speaking back and forth. Like Peterson says, the left and the right emerge for this reason. Political things can be understood through the context of this is the source of all things. Why do you have a left and a right rather than 85 different things? It always keeps going back to left and right. We'll talk about political manipulation some other day and the artificial whatever. But the left and right, the conservative and liberal impulses do emerge in the conversation no matter what the topic. And so, well, what's going on? Peterson says it this way. He says, well, the right is defining things, is caring about borders. And the left is saying, hey, we could be missing out on stuff on the other side of those borders, right? So if all you have is the principle of build more walls, you've got nothing you can call exceedingly good, and you don't have habitable order. You don't have livable space. You don't have some creation. If all you have is no walls at all, who trusts anybody? Who's protected? Who's valued? Who's loved? Nothing, right? Both are wrong. Both are correct. Both need to listen to each other, right? That's a healthy political, just like the healthy between the hemispheres, right? It's supposed to be everything. Well, it reveals itself to be everything because from his perspective, he's getting as far back as he can and say, this is in the creation myth. This is the source of what you are. As Descartes said, you're made up of non-being and godness. You're made up of absolute I am, and you're made up of chaotic potential and ever shiftingness. And you're in the line between the two. Okay. Where is hell? Where is something you can't live? Well, habitable order has to be a proper relationship, wrestling, and balance between those things. So it's part of his perspective. We talked about how this is also contained in this story. I think the Spirit of God is hovering over the deep. All these stories are attempting to get at the ultimate truth. They are all approximating the same thing. They're doing it so well that you can build civilizations out of apes by doing it. There's a triunity at the base of being. They're identifying things that are really profound and hard to figure out how they got to, except through the word revelation. And Jung's idea that that's coming from the dreams might help people to swallow that, perhaps. And if you can figure that out as an ancient artist, then maybe we should pay attention. If you can figure out things like that, I made a note that he's not as interested in the overlap between these traditions. Like he's not trying to say they all mean the same thing. Rather that he's saying, well, you're getting at it and you're getting at it. He's also not saying, well, this one got at it best, although maybe he thinks that one tradition has figured it out better than others. He's not passing judgment on that at all. He's just saying we're going to approach the scriptures, the Christian, the Pentateuch, the Judeo creation myth and the foundational stories there. Let's approach it and see what we can get out of it. That's all he's doing. He's not saying the other ones are worthless. He's not saying they're all equal. He's not making a judgment on that. He's just saying let's see what happens if we do this experiment. Okay. The last question that was asked in the after conversation about this whole Petersonian approach was this idea of like, now wait a minute, you're talking a lot about myth, crazy dream world stuff. Where does the science come in? Where does the rationality come in? You talked about wanting to be evolutionary in your approach. You talked about not wanting to be overly reductionist, but not wanting to say things that you couldn't defend in argument. Because remember, you got your propositions now; they got to be defensible. So I drew a sketch. The deepest, the most profound, the foundational. We don't have to agree with this. One thing we're trying to do is just comprehend how Peterson's approaching this or what this kind of approach consists of. We've got the foundational, this dream myth narrative language. Then on top of that, limited and within the scope and nestled within it is this philosophical propositional, this stuff where I'm making a statement. It could be true, it could be false. Let's argue it out. Let's use logic. Let's see if we can prove it's self-contradictory or if it leads to an absurdity. Let's debate it all out. That's philosophy. That's what we've been doing. And then within that, if you add a few restrictions like don't talk to me about things because I won't regard them as meaningful unless they have a measurable consequence that I could test or in theory potentially d- disprove or falsify. Okay, we're going to wrap up right now. I just got your message. Okay. Okay, so that's within that. They're built in this way. Now Peterson's coming along and says, "Hey, let's drill down here and see what we might find." All right, so he's gonna dig down there. That doesn't mean that anything that's poetic and artistic counts as truth. Okay, first of all, you could be digging in the wrong area. Secondly, you can think you found something, but really it was your own preconceived notion, right? We don't have all of the rules of right. This is a less safe place to be exploring when it comes to trying to not make mistakes. So he's going to try to find the deep, profound meaning. He's going to do his best to put it in a propositional language talking about the stories. Sometimes those will be ethical statements or philosophical ideas. He then says, well, I've got to be chained to these other things, the rules of right reason. So if I do think I've extracted something like that, the proper adjudicators of that are the philosophers. Let's use the rules of right reason and say, oh, you heard the story wrong, or it wasn't a good story, or you were digging in the wrong place, or you projected that into the story and it wasn't there, or it's just a shit story because if it does come from the story, we know that's not right. It's self contradictory, but also with the humility of realizing that this philosophical is nested in things it doesn't understand and requires them to exist. So there's a back and forth in that conversation between these realms. And more rarely, we're going to wrap it up. This is the last slide. More rarely, you might think that you had found something of empirical consequence. Well, if you think so, maybe you got the wrong thing out of the story, maybe you got the right thing out of the story, but the proper adjudicators are the ones who are doing scientific experiments and who can try to set up an experiment to disprove it. And maybe you're right, and maybe that'll be the source of a revolution in science. This is probably pretty rare to get something like that out of this, but maybe it would happen. In any case, it's then submitted to the adjudication of the people who are doing the scientific conversation because your statement is that type of statement. Also, he qualifies it with don't be too overconfident that we know what we think we know in science either. So there's still a back and forth in that conversation. More regularly, these truths are truths to live by, which makes them outside the regimes of needing to be subjected to those other disciplines. The experiment has to be run by, so the actual experiment is run by your behavior in your life, seeing how well the ideas work out in that pragmatic attitude of saying, well, this has to be a truth to live by. So do I live well when I'm living by it? That type of thing. So it's unfortunate or fortunate. It's too profound and deep for a simple, hey, I figured out it's true ahead of time kind of a thing. It's like the question, should I marry this woman? You're not going to get a scientist to tell you, yes, that will work out well. You're not going to get a philosopher who, I mean, you can use ethics and those things to try to make sense of it, but it's too profound for that type of an answer. You have to do it. You have to live it. You have to see how it works out. Okay, so we're done. We're gonna wrap it up quickly. We started late, and that was a lot to go over. So we're gonna end the stream right now. We've just finished the first part of his lecture. We'll either do the Q&A or we'll just immediately start probably the second lecture in his series. This is in our deep dive on Peterson in the context of the third year material, where we get to smash and look at all of philosophy a third time through the lens of Nietzsche. All right, we'll see you all next time.